It was now the 23rd of September, and I was lying still at the head of the broad stairway, and there was commotion down below. "Those ruddy Huns again," said the glider pilot. There was a shuffling, and German orders were being rapped out. Then some SS troops dashed up the stairs. A sinister-looking type, about 20 years old, led the way and was coming right at me. I found myself looking straight down the barrel of his Schmeiser, his trigger finger shaking. I didn't bat an eyelid. I just did not want to upset him and give him a cause to let rip. He was glaring at me with red, beady eyes. Christ, this is it, I thought. I had heard of other wounded being shot up, but my luck was in and he passed me by. He and 2 other SS men had a good look around and then took up firing positions at windows in rooms leading off the landing. As they started to fire out, Colonel Warwick dashed up the stairs, swearing and rebuking them for firing from a clearly marked Red Cross building. Discipline took over. They looked defiant and sullen, but with fingers handling their automatics hesitantly, they reluctantly obeyed the officer's command and stopped firing. So as I talked about earlier clearly these are some Germans that have respect for the law of armed conflict. And let's just start with this. We're in the hospital building, and now we got the Germans in the building using it as a firing position. I don't even know what to say about this. Like, what does that even? How do you even translate that into reality? You're wounded. Your hospital is getting mortared and machine gunned, and then there's German enemy soldiers in your building firing from inside your building, walking around, looking at you. Oh, and he comments about this. It was most strange to have enemy in the building one minute, only be replaced by your own combat men the next. So that's his statement about it. Is that, yeah, it was strange. I wondered how the rest of my 1st Para Battalion were doing. Right from the Sunday night, our R company had a tough time losing half of its men in the D. Doodle area. Then 40 men of 6th Platoon, S Company, were killed in 2 minutes on the approach to Arnhem. And in the Den Brink St. Elizabeth's Hospital and factory area, the rest of the battalion was badly mauled. In the midst of it all, Father Benson, a Roman Catholic priest, was busy making his rounds and answering urgent calls. One man so constantly needed. Things began to get on my nerves that morning. Which is kind of interesting. Because he's been through all this stuff. He's wounded. He's surrounded by the enemy. He's on his however many hundreds of days in close combat that he's been in over the past few years. Mm-hmm. And now that he's wounded and surrounded, and there's men screaming and dying all around him, things are getting on his nerves a little bit this morning.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's what Reg is up to. Mm-hmm. So things began to get on my nerves that morning. What with the continuous din of battle outside and my leg getting more painful through lack of proper medical attention, I called for Father Benson to offer a few words of comfort. So he came and put me at my ease. Later, he was wounded by tank fire into the building. I'm sorry to say that he died from those wounds and was buried in the grounds of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. On the following day, the disposition was frightening. Once again, understatement. The British understatement. Because as far as I'm concerned, everything up to this point is completely horrifying. On the following day, the disposition was frightening. Our men were still doing their damnedest, but the Germans were slowly closing in, very slowly, mark you, for they lost heavily and had to fight for every inch of the bloody ground they got there. With things getting hotter still, I was moved again to what was thought to be a safer spot, just to the other side and along the landing area. Suddenly, there was an almighty explosion in the room on my right. Men were already wounded once, twice, were hit again, and some were killed. There were piteous cries coming from that room. It was at this time that Major John Waddy of the 156th Parachute Battalion, who had started his parachute days in India when the battalion was first formed, was wounded again, and 2 English medics and a Dutch nurse were killed. A medic now came out, cradling a form in his arms. The chap he carried could have been dead or unconscious. He was covered in blood, and his arm was shattered and hung pathetically by his side, his left leg bandaged from his first wounding. Christ, I wish I were outside. There was another resounding crash of bombs followed by curses. Perhaps I was better off in here. It was bloody awful for everyone, everywhere. Outside, the situation was getting completely out of hand. Further enemy reinforcements were mustering around the perimeter in the form of powerfully armed tanks from the SS Panzer divisions with long-barreled high explosives and armor-piercing shells. The passage where I lay ran from front to rear of the hotel, and I was facing the rear with a grandstand view of the battle through a gaping hole in the wall where once there had been a window. Now and again, one of our men would break cover to stalk the enemy, and then the enemy would repeat the process with the multiple accompaniment of shell burst, tank fire, machine gun fire, curses, and yelps of pain. I heard the ominous sound of an approaching tank. I couldn't see it, but the squeaking of its caterpillar wheels grew even louder. Then it came into view, its great gun traversing from right to left. Picking its way through the trees, it stopped for a few minutes to feel its way, and then the gun barked out, sending a shell across my front to an unseen target. The other wounded were lying huddled together, trying to afford each other protection. The floor was littered with debris, blood, and glass, and there was an incessant whine and explosion of mortar bombs, together with the shriek and crash of artillery vibrating the very foundations of the building, which I thought would at some point tumble down. I don't know what time it was when the shelling and gunfire stopped, but after a din of the last 6 days, it felt very strange to suddenly be so much quieter. There was still spasmodic firing in the distance and a little shelling, but nothing to worry about. We began to converse more freely. "Gone on strike, Jerry?" one man almost shouted, except that he had half his mouth bandaged from a shell splinter wound. "Nah, he's packed up as Jerry and buggered off," a Cockney put in. The glider pilot was more cautious. "Crafty sod is the Hun. He's got something up his sleeve." Then I saw men being carried downstairs with great activity going on outside, but not of battle. 2 medics picked me up, both of them silent and not looking too pleased. "Where to now?" I asked. "The Elizabeth Hospital," one told me. The enemy had overrun us and was calling the shots. So, the Germans were now in control. He gets taken outside. Outside was a ghastly sight with the fallen dead of both our sides lying where they had gone down. British and German medical orderlies were putting the wounded into jeeps and various other vehicles, including 2 small vans improvised as makeshift ambulances. 3 of us stretcher cases were loaded into a small open German lorry with shallow sides, which would prevent us from bouncing off in transit. There was just enough room for 5 walking wounded. Now they're on this drive. We all had shattered bones of some sort, which made us cry out in pain during the rough ride in this antiquated lorry, and I was still more than pleased when it finally came to a standstill at Journey's End. At the hospital, there had clearly been heavy fighting, and as spent cartridges could be seen littering the floor and entranceway. I heard the familiar voice of a friend. "What the hell are you doing on that stretcher? Scrounging for a lift?" I went to answer, but nothing came out. Can you imagine you go to a hospital and the floor's got bullet casings all over it? Word got around that the whole show was over, and I began to wonder what really went wrong. The battle had been lost, but it had been some fight. As Mortar Sergeant Dick Whittingham later wryly remarked, "We may have lost the battle at Arnhem, but we did come in second." It should be noted that there had not only been a great loss of life in this battle, but also massive local destruction, with 1 in 4 houses totally destroyed and most of the remainder badly damaged. And so, again, I talked about seeing the different sides of the Germans. And, we already saw some of the Germans, the prisoners, being sickened by what the kind of civilian casualties were taking place as they evacuated Dunkirk. The Germans that were firing inside the hospital, and then when they get told by an unarmed, leader, hey, get out of here, they're okay, fine. They're grumpy, but they leave. Just the fact that the patients the wounded are getting treated actually pretty well. So they end up in this sort of makeshift hospital. A South African orthopedic surgeon, Captain Alexander Lipman Kessel, was going to see me. He commanded one of the surgical teams of the 16th Para Field Ambulance. I was thankful that I was not going to have a German butcher. I had seen the end result of a German doctor's amputation of a man's foot, crudely almost guillotined and without anesthetic. I was carried into a large room with medical apparatus everywhere, trolleys and tables laden with all sorts of instruments, bandages, field dressing, and splints. I was placed on a hard, narrow table about 4 feet from the ground. In the distance, I could hear the sound of gunfire and German flak, which meant that our aircraft were in the vicinity. The anesthesist had his needle at the ready, and medics were preparing for the operation when there was a noise rather like a giant balloon having air released, and then a terrific explosion. With a very quick presence of mind, one medic threw a blanket over me and shielded me from the blast with his own body, as shattered glass fell in small pieces and slivers all over the operating theater. Then all went quiet again, and the blanket was pulled carefully to reveal yours truly with popping eyes. My treatment had to wait another day while the place was cleaned up. Fortunately for me, the next visit was uninterrupted. The wound was cleaned and redressed, and I had my first plaster cast put on. And so, like I said, it seems like at this point it's relatively civilized. I mean, if you can forgive a bomb exploding while you're about to get surgery, but relatively civilized compared to what they'd been through. At one point, there's a SS officer comes in, and they kind of go through the different individuals there, and they finally get to him. And when he tells them he's a airborne guy, they say, "You're going to a prisoner of war camp." And he says here, it was September 28th. It was the 28th of September when German orderlies carried me out of the hospital, not so carefully as our own medics, and I had to hang onto the sides of the stretcher as we descended the stone steps at the entrance to avoid sliding off. And now he gets transported again. This time he ends up at the Wilhelm III Kaserne Barracks. We were given iron beds with straw-filled pillows, and the floors were dirty. There was no heating and only a meager supply of medical necessities. And then at one point, a doctor, or I presume he was, entered the room, accompanied by a Rottenführer of the SS Medical Corps. The stench from my wound caused disapproval on the face of the doctor, and grabbing my big toe with his finger, he slowly raised the leg which began to bend at the wound beneath the knee where both the tibia and fibia were broken. Stopping, he peered at the wound inquisitively. "Do you mind? That hurts," I told him, whereupon he simply released the hold of my leg and let it fall on the hard table, instantly turning to go, looking at me in the eyes with a sadistic expression as he did so. "You bastard square-headed shite-hawk," I said. I couldn't care less if he didn't understand the phrase. He just raised an eyebrow with an inquiring look and departed, while I returned to my private world of pain. Then the medics came back with that infernal SS guard and redressed and replastered my leg. So, like I said, it's not great treatment, but let's face it, he's alive. And he goes on here, "I was at the barracks for a little more than a week when one morning I was prepared for yet another move, this time a short journey to the Juliana Hospital in Apeldoorn. My stay at Juliana Hospital was going to be the longest and best as far as medical cares go. The hospital was staffed with Dutch doctors and nurses, helped by our own doctors and orderlies, and the Germans left us well alone to fend for our own medical requirements." Like I said, that seems fairly civilized to me. And they're trying to help him out, and here we go. "It was decided to apply a gadget called